David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Impeachment is the word of the day. The first step of the impeachment process of Donald Trump has started, and Donald Trump is flying off the rails as a result. We will talk about all of this. This is an impeachment inquiry, important word. A lot of people very clearly not understanding the full process, and why would you? Impeachment of presidents is not a common thing. This was announced yesterday by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Let's take a look.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella.
So there's confusion about what this is and what this is not. Impeachment is a long process. There are 3 primary steps, and these can be subdivided into even really 10 or 12 different steps. But the generality, the 3 primary phases are an impeachment inquiry. If the inquiry leads the inquirers to decide that actually impeaching the president via a trial is appropriate, you go to an impeachment trial by the House of Representatives. And after that phase is complete, phase 2, you go to phase 3, which is a vote in the Senate as to whether or not to convict the president and thus remove them from office. Now, this is not going to lead to a conviction of Donald Trump in the Senate and thus the removal of Donald Trump. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. We don't have to go through the details, but as you know, if you've been following politics for the last couple of years, with some very limited exceptions, Republicans are not interested, willing, or even remotely considering removing this president from office. So the process that Democrats will now follow must be strategic, and it must be thought out, because Donald Trump will try, and he is already trying, you will see his tweets momentarily, to turn this around into he's the victim, he's a martyr just doing great things for the United States, and these witch hunt Democrats won't let him just make America great again. So the goal here is hurt Trump in 2020, because the impeachment process is not going to remove Donald Trump. So that then becomes a question of, are we confident that Democrats can carry this out in the right way? Is there going to be infighting among Democrats around this such that it will become a distraction? We already saw there's this member of Congress from Hawaii who is running for president named Tulsi Gabbard. She says she's against what Nancy Pelosi is doing. Are we going to see conflict within the Democratic Party that will allow Donald Trump to take advantage of this in some way? Last night I did a live stream on YouTube about the breaking impeachment news, and there were a lot of people who were saying, David, you know, this talk of impeachment backfiring, that's a Republican talking point. No. I'm not talking about the process backfiring insofar as the impeachment inquiry is not warranted. On the substance, Donald Trump clearly deserves, at minimum, an impeachment inquiry. Will not put the cart before the horse. Depending on what the inquiry finds, we can talk about whether the impeachment trial is the next step. That's not what I mean when I say backfire. What I mean by backfire is that if Democrats bungle the process, if Democrats bungle the PR around this, it will allow Donald Trump to paint himself successfully as the victim martyr, and it will not hurt him in 2020. I've been getting emails from people saying, David, it's over for Trump. Trump needs to resign and set up Mike Pence to pardon him the way that Richard Nixon did. Number one, it's unlikely that Donald Trump's ego would allow that to happen, but I don't think it's necessary. Donald Trump is not going to be convicted on impeachment by a Republican-controlled Senate before January of 2021, which is when the next Congress and president would be sworn in. So there are 2 ways that this can go, given that Trump won't be removed before the election. Number one, this doesn't work because Americans get exhausted by 14 months of it, or however many months, I guess 13 months leading up to the election, and it ends up helping Donald Trump. That's one way. The other way it can go is that the inquiry reveals the president's wrongdoing in such an uncontestable way to such a degree that it destroys Trump and Republicans in the 2020 election. When we go back to Bill Clinton, people like to remind me that Bill Clinton's approval went up during impeachment. But remember, number one, Bill Clinton didn't try to interfere. Number two, Bill Clinton had a strong economy. And number three, what was at issue were lies about an affair. Donald Trump has engaged in borderline traitorous behavior. And of course, Donald Trump is absolutely losing it on Twitter, which is an indication that he is not going to allow this process to play out calmly in the way that Bill Clinton did. I've been telling you for years, if impeachment starts, what we've seen on Twitter so far by Donald Trump will be nothing compared to what we will see. And it's already happening. Donald Trump starting to wind up yesterday, tweeting, such an important day at the United Nations, so much work and so much success. And the Democrats purposely had to ruin and demean it with more breaking news witch hunt garbage. So bad for our country. Later tweeting, presidential harassment in all caps. And then this morning, scaling it up even more, Donald Trump tweeting, quote, there has been no president in the history of our capital C country who has been treated so badly as I have. The Democrats are frozen with hatred and fear. They get nothing done. This should never be allowed to happen to another president. Witch hunt. So remember, Trump won't be removed by this impeachment because once again, Republicans control the Senate. But Donald Trump is already losing it. If there were to be, listen, imagine if Donald Trump were to be convicted and removed by the Senate. Imagine the level of violence that we would see happening from Trumpists. I would actually consider staying away from public places. I really would. But in the end, that's not going to happen. And the conversation has been about, is the president going to be removed? And what is the strategy on that basis? The real question is, should the president be impeached given what we know? And the answer is, as far as an impeachment inquiry, obviously yes. So this inquiry is the first step, and it is the correct step. There is no question about it. The political strategy around it is important, given that the Senate is not going to vote to convict. But on the facts, obviously, there is a completely obvious case for why this impeachment inquiry is now starting. And it's not only Donald Trump who's flipping out, it's also Rudy Giuliani. Let's talk about that next. You can tell tensions are running very high within Donald Trump's inner circle because of the start of this impeachment inquiry against him. And Donald Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, went on TV yesterday and absolutely lost it, starting to call the other guest a moron. And I get it. Everything is coming crashing down around the Trump administration. They are panicked. They are now planning to put out what is effectively the Barr Letter 2.0. I'll talk to you about that in the next segment with regard to the transcript of Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president in July. So I understand why this is happening. Check this out. Look at the abuse that Rudy Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, hurls at his fellow guest on Fox News' Laura Ingraham program. The person Rudy Giuliani is attacking here is Chris Hahn, who's a former aide to Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer. Clearly, Rudy is not pleased with him. Take a look at this.
Irresponsibly say.
Please.
Yeah, well, you actually usually say incredibly stupid things.
You're a public figure.
Yeah, and by the way, do you have any idea that the State Department...
So then you know the libel
Okay,
law.
hold on.
I would
Shut up,
assume you know the
moron.
libel law then.
Shut up.
Okay, hold on.
Shut up.
Hold
You don't
on.
know what you're
Everybody-
talking about.
Chris,
you don't know what
Chris,
you're talking about, idiot.
I do.
The state... No, you don't. You just
Mr.
lied.
Mayor, I wish you would stop.
You lied, my
I wish
friend.
you would stop, Mr. Mayor.
Well, why don't
New
you
Yorkers
tell him
remember you in
why
your
don't you
glory,
tell
and
him...
I wish you would stop.
Why don't you
Okay.
tell him to keep his mouth shut so we can tell the truth?
Yeah, Chris,
okay?
just let Rudy
Just keep your
say,
lying
and then
mouth
you can
shut.
respond. You
Okay,
can
he
try to-
said...
Now, for a while, Rudy Giuliani was known for drinking before going on evening television shows that he would appear on, and it was a big problem for a while. People around Trump were trying to keep Rudy Giuliani on daytime shows because he wouldn't be drinking before those, at least not often. I don't know if that was a factor here, but yelling "shut up, moron" the day your client formally becomes the target of an impeachment inquiry does not exactly scream confident cooperation for the benefit of your client, does it? I don't know that "shut up, moron" totally clears the president, as Donald Trump often likes to say. So first of all, I get it. This is not good for anyone, and everybody around Donald Trump is panicking. Tensions are running extremely high. The other thing is that Rudy Giuliani could actually end up being a far more sinister player in all of this. than we've known up till now. And I think that in addition to an impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani should be investigated because Rudy Giuliani is the president's personal attorney. And what he's doing is traveling all around the world, lobbying on behalf of all sorts of different interests, some of them foreign interests. Rudy Giuliani was involved in his lobbying Ukraine to smear Joe Biden. That we know at this point. Rudy's admitted it, and Trump has admitted it. Rudy Giuliani was recently with Romanian leaders criticizing anti-corruption efforts going on there. And there are immediately questions about who is Rudy Giuliani speaking for when he does this stuff. Does he speak for the president? Does he speak for the State Department? Is he communicating anything that is an official or a pseudo-official position for the U.S. government? The government has clarified Rudy does not speak for them. But that actually raises even more questions about who's paying Rudy Giuliani for what he's doing. Is he properly registered under FARA for the work that he is doing, sometimes in the interests of foreign governments? It's truly unheard of, but that is the name of the game here. All of this stuff is not okay. The Ukraine stuff, the money laundering allegation. I mean, there's this long list of stuff. But is anybody going to be held accountable for it? Because that has been the Trump experiment. Yeah, this stuff is not okay, but are they going to do anything to us? And so far, the system has not actually dealt with what the president's administration has been willing to do. And unless that changes, they are getting away with all of it. Let me know what you think about all of this, the wisdom of the impeachment inquiry, how Democrats should carry it forward. I want to hear from you. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And so yesterday I said I was going to be live streaming on Twitch. I ended up live streaming on YouTube yesterday. Tonight, I am live streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. We'll be talking about this, and I hope to see you there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Shannon Driscoll. Shannon, thank you. Really appreciate your support, as well as Queenie Wynn. Queenie, I also really appreciate your support. Also want to say thanks to someone who's been a member for almost 5 years, today's longtime sustainer of the day, and that's Christian Gajewski, who has been a member for almost 5 years to the day. Thanks to all of you great folks, and make sure to join them by signing up at joinpakman.com. Takes a minute, and it does really great things. Today is a very special day because we are starting to go to Hatriot Mail that relates to the presumption that Donald Trump will be reelected in 2020. Now, I don't totally disagree that that is not only a plausible, but a moderately likely scenario. But before we get to that, a quick reminder, what is Hatriot Mail?
Because Mexico is still paying for the wall, right? I mean, that's what he said at all the campaign. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Okay, so this is, once again, Hatriot Mail that is starting to deal with the particulars of what Hatriots believe is going to happen in November of 2020. Let's take a look at this week's Hatriot Mail.
You pricks. You should know better. F*** you. I am sick to death of the self-righteous, arrogant f***s like you. Rot in hell. MAGA hats forever and winning even longer. Will you cry in November 2020s? God, I hope to hell you life streams so we can all see it for myself.
Yeah, so listen, I'm going to be doing plenty of live streaming. I don't know that I will be crying. And again, as I've said before, this is a conversation that many progressive shows have had. We all know that Donald Trump being reelected would be far better for our programs and our businesses than, I don't know, certainly better than just Joe Biden becomes president of the United States. But I've not seen any progressive hosts say, and therefore I want Trump to be reelected. I recognize Trump is good for business. and I want him got as soon as possible. But you may not be wrong. It is certainly feasible that Donald Trump will be reelected to another 4 years. I did a commentary about that on the Monday show. Fight hatriotism by signing up for a membership at joinpacman.com, using the coupon code Hatriot40. It saves you 40%, and it makes Hatriots cry that their hatriotism is not accomplishing anything for their political ideology. Okay, let's follow up on what's going on with the Ukraine story. As I told you yesterday, every couple of hours, we get some additional confirmation or admission that the entire Donald Trump extortion of the Ukrainian president by withholding hundreds of millions of dollars in aid under the demand that Ukraine smear Joe Biden is coming out as reported from the beginning exactly. Every few hours, we learn another 5% of the story is true. Now, you might remember yesterday, we learned that Donald Trump indeed withheld the aid. And in fact, we found out that the decision was made just a few days before Donald Trump's July 2019 phone call with the Ukrainian president. But you might also recall that Donald Trump explained the reason he didn't want to give Ukraine the money was because he didn't want to give money to a corrupt country like he supposedly discussed on the phone with the Ukrainian president. That was explanation number one. Donald Trump has now come up with a completely different explanation, which I guess we can call explanation number two, which is that the reason he withheld the aid from Ukraine is he was mad at the European Union for not having contributed more money to Ukraine, which is not even remotely believable. Donald Trump spoke to reporters before heading to meetings at the United Nations in New York City, which were an entirely separate gong show that I will talk about with you a little bit later on today. And Donald Trump said, yeah, I did withhold the financial aid from Ukraine, but it was because he wants other countries in Europe to be giving more money to Ukraine, not, of course, because he was trying to strong-arm Ukraine into investigating and subsequently smearing Joe Biden. Let's take a look at the video. Also note that Donald Trump says in the same sentence that he gave them the money, but that he would withhold it again, which is an implicit confirmation that he did withhold it, which he previously admitted to, but now denies, and then immediately self-contradicts. If my explanation is confusing, if that summary is confusing, then you are correctly understanding it. It is incredibly confusing. Take a look at this.
So here's the story, very simply. We're watching Venezuela very closely. As far as withholding funds, those funds were paid. They were fully paid. But my complaint has always been, and I'd withhold again, and I'll continue to withhold until such time as Europe and other nations contribute to Ukraine, because they're not doing it. It's the United States. We're putting up the bulk of the money. And I'm asking, why is that? And I want Europe, and it's always been this, and everybody knows it, every single reporter knows it, everybody in the administration knows that what I want, and I insist on it, is that Europe has to put up money for Ukraine also. Why is it only the United States putting up the money?
So listen, Trump's definitely panicking here. But this is also a strategy, sometimes known as the Gish Gallop, sometimes known as the fire hose of falsehood. And Rudy Giuliani has been a big player in Donald Trump employing this strategy. You say something different every day. Rudy is a pro at it. Trump is pretty good at it. You say one thing, and then the next day you say the opposite. And what you're counting on is people ultimately just being too damn exhausted or confused to really figure it out, combined with bamboozling your own supporters into believing that you at some point explained it, even though they're all contradictory explanations. And unfortunately, it often works. They're actually doing something right here, which is that while everyone who cares about the facts is busy trying to figure out what happened, Trump and Rudy and everybody else are trying to get ahead of it and shaping the narrative, just like the William Barr propaganda letter was able to get out ahead of the Mueller report and obfuscate and completely mislead with Barr's summary of Mueller's report. Then they use that bogus propaganda letter as the reference document that all the Trumpists point to and say, we got the real story. We got it in William Barr's letter, even though that letter was completely divorced from the reality of what the Mueller report said. Now, as I mentioned to you yesterday, the real story here is the suppression of the whistleblower report. And that has gone by the wayside. And the discussion is increasingly shaped by Donald Trump about the reasons why he withheld the aid. And the content of that July 2019 phone call with the Ukrainian president What we really need is the whistleblower complaint and the whistleblower to testify under oath, not some absurd phone call transcript that Donald Trump now says he is going to put out. And that is exactly what we want to talk about next. Let's dig into the transcript. I told you yesterday that the Trump-Ukraine-Biden fiasco is going to become all about the transcript of the July 2019 phone call between Trump and the Ukrainian president, and that this is a distraction. And exactly as we discussed yesterday, the White House is now going to be putting out a transcript of that phone call. Now, the White House has a history of doctoring transcripts. The quid pro quo is unlikely to be evident just from one phone call's transcript anyway. And the most important part of all of this is that a whistleblower report is being suppressed. The whistleblower report about all of this is the most important thing, not the transcript. So now that Donald Trump plans to release the transcript, we need to understand that it will be exactly what we discussed yesterday. It's going to be the Barr Letter 2.0, okay? So to reset once again, in case the details are becoming murky, the idea here, the claim, is that Joe Biden meddled in the Ukrainian judicial system to help his son. Now, this is a conspiracy theory for which there is no evidence, and I debunked it yesterday, and I'm not going to waste your time with it again today. But what Donald Trump then did is he went and he pressured the Ukrainian president, reportedly 8 times, to open an investigation into Biden in order to smear him. And Trump has admitted to talking to the Ukrainian president about Joe Biden. He's admitted that Joe Biden's alleged corruption was a topic of discussion during the phone call with the Ukrainian president. And his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, also admitted this on live television. And Donald Trump withheld between $250 million and $400 million in military aid to Ukraine, understood to be over the Biden smear requests, but that part has not been definitively confirmed. So now we hear Trump is going to release a transcript of the call from July 2019 with the Ukrainian president. But please understand what's going to happen here. And I told you yesterday, it will be just like the Barr Letter. Trump is going to release a transcript that he thinks will help him. Trump lies about everything. He lies about the size of his crowds. He lies about the size of his whatever. He lies about his own intelligence. He lies about the weather on Inauguration Day. He lies about everything. So the transcript that is released will be muddy enough that it won't be obvious and overt corruption and quid pro quo. And that lack of brazen and obvious corruption in that one phone call will then be used by Trump and his defenders to say, see, look, I told you, there's nothing to see here. They will claim Trump is exonerated by the transcript. We need the whistleblower report, but it needs to be given directly to Congress. The Trump administration should not be allowed to review and modify the report before it's given to Congress, which is the direction things are going in right now. We need the whistleblower to testify before Congress. Anything like what is being alleged here, this pressure on the Ukrainian president, it would be set up with much more than just a single phone call in July of 2019. And what we need to do is not allow Donald Trump to distract with the transcript, whatever form that transcript ultimately takes. Any whistleblower report released by the White House must be treated as unreliable and incomplete, period. It will be edited. It will be misleading. It has to be treated as such by corporate media. We will see if they actually do treat it that way. But this is now layer upon layer of obfuscation and misdirection. You have initially, you have a whistleblower who came forward and said, I want to blow the whistle about this. You then had that covered with the Joe Biden conspiracy theory, which is, hey, Joe Biden was there specifically to make sure that his son doesn't have a problem because he's working with this Ukrainian gas company, blah, blah, blah. We debunked that yesterday. Then on top of that is the White House coming out and actually copying to some elements of what's being alleged about aid being withheld, although they don't agree as to why it was done, etc. And then now layer 4 on top of this, these are just distraction layers stacked one on top of the other, is that the transcript is going to be released and maybe the whistleblower report in some edited form is going to be released. We've got to cut through like 3 layers of BS here to get what ultimately is most important, which is a whistleblower report that is being suppressed, period. We are going to be making a number of posts about this story, including a poll to the show's Instagram page, which is at David Pakman Show. Make sure you're following the show on Instagram. And while you're there, follow me on Instagram as well, at david.pakman. We will take a quick break and be back with so much more right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Cailin O'Connor, who's a philosopher and mathematician, as well as an associate professor at UC Irvine and author of the book, The Misinformation Age. Cailin, it's so great to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, David.
So I think to start with, when we think about the way that misinformation spreads, I've read opinions or pieces that say we need to think about it almost like a virus spreads. Others who talk about other sort of analogies that can be used. When we just broadly start to think about how misinformation spreads, and we can include in misinformation actual fake news, not the definition that the current president sometimes applies, but like actual fake news, conspiracy theories fall under this, whatever types of information we want to talk about. What is the general way we should be thinking about how these spread through society?
Yeah, so misinformation is such a broad topic, and I should say some misinformation is not like other misinformation.
Yes.
But one useful way people have modeled this is literally using models from epidemiology. So models intended to understand how literal viruses go from person to person to person, like 2 people meet, and then there's some chance the virus spreads. So the analogy would be that 2 people meet, and then there's some chance that an idea or misinformation spreads from person to person. Part of the reason I think this is so important to understand is that in the middle of this crisis of misinformation, false belief, fake news, a lot of people have tried to understand, okay, what goes wrong with human reasoning? You know, why are humans so bad at figuring out what's true about the world? And I think that a better perspective is to ask, what kind of social environments are we in? And how do these allow this kind of misinformation and false beliefs to spread?
Yeah, along those lines, the average person, when we hear something that we've either not heard before and we have to assess the truth or falsity of it, or we hear something that contradicts a pre-existing belief, it seems that there's a number of levels on which we're evaluating what we're hearing. And part of that is the content itself. Part of it is the context. And context, of course, includes some kind of assessment of the trustworthiness of where we are hearing the information. Let's start with that piece first. What do we know about how the average person is assessing what is considered trustworthy as a source, be it as an individual person or a news network or publication? What's the process that we go through?
Yeah, good. So there seem to be a lot of things that go into people's assessment of like, okay, I've heard from something from this source. Do I trust that source? And some of these things are really good things. So if someone has lied to us or misinformed us before, we're less likely to trust them this time.
Yes.
And that's smart. If we know that some news source has a really good reputation, sometimes we're more likely to trust them, and that's smart. But then we also have all of these kind of psychological little tricks and rules for how we trust people that don't necessarily do good things for us when it comes to false belief. So, for example, we just trust people who we judge to be more like us. And that could be they're my same gender or race, or they're also in my football club. And those things don't actually guide us towards people who are better at sharing true beliefs or helping us develop good beliefs.
Are there ways in which the understanding that we have and that institutions and corporations and governments have in how we are making these assessments can sort of be used against individuals to make them more likely to believe something that is not true?
Oh, so people's understanding of these facts about our sort of social psychology and the way we update beliefs. Yeah. So one thing that we should all understand is that what we might call broadly propagandists, so people who have some stake in getting us to believe something and who are trying to get us to believe things, and this could be industry, it could be different government bodies, it could be political parties, it could be Russian agents. These influence groups often are very savvy to the ways in which we are social learners and our knowledge is deeply social. So if you look, just to give an example, at Russian disinformation, it's often designed to, so they'll design some meme in such a way that they know people are going to be sharing it from person to person with those they trust. And they know that what's going to happen is they're not going to be the source of that information to others. Instead, everyone's going to see it from someone who's their friend or their family member. And so they design it in a way to take advantage of this fact that we tend to trust the people we know and love and think are somehow similar to us.
That's interesting. So it seems that with that, there's probably also some social status component in terms of the people that are replicating the idea, maybe. I mean, I can imagine, a simple example would be you happen to live in a part of the country that has a significant anti-vaccine community, as an example. And so merely for sort of social acceptance and social status reasons, you become more likely to replicate those ideas. Is that to some degree something you've observed?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So many people call this conformity bias. So the underlying psychological thing is that it's uncomfortable for people to stick out from the pack. We like being like other people. And as you pointed out, we in particular like to mimic or conform with people who we consider to be high status, who have a lot of power or a lot of money, or we think they're cool, or we just really like them and everyone else likes them. And you also see a lot of misinformation campaigns taking advantage of that. So, for example, anti-vaxxers who get celebrities to scare everyone about vaccines are taking advantage of this kind of bias towards conformity, and especially the fact that we like to conform with these high-status people.
I get the sense that there's some feedback loop here between the spread of misinformation and political polarization in the United States, but I'm not sure where the circle starts. So if you look at, for example, what Jonathan Haidt has written about, he might argue that the political polarization is coming as a sort of effect more than a cause in some of these cycles. But I could sort of think about it either way. I mean, we could see that for other reasons, there's more polarization, and this primes people to be more likely to accept misinformation. You could also think about it the other way, which is that for non-political reasons, misinformation is spreading more easily, technological reasons, social media, whatever, and that therefore is increasing political polarization. Is it a one-way thing, one way or the other, or is it more of a persistent feedback loop?
When it comes to polarization, I mean, untangling this knot of what is happening and why, I think is really complicated. So one thing that my co-author and I argue in the Misinformation Age, and we sort of use mathematical models to do this, is that there are different things that can cause polarization. So in some ways, it's almost overdetermined that you can get feedback loops based on social trust. So we don't trust people who have different beliefs than us. And so once beliefs start pulling apart in these polarized communities, we don't trust the evidence coming from them. They don't trust it coming from us. And suddenly you have stable polarization. Conformity that I was talking about before can lead to polarization too. We're all conforming in some clique in a social network. Other people are conforming. And because we have these different social pressures, we won't trust or we won't uptake the kind of information or ideas coming from another group. So that can cause polarization. Just listening to different news sources so that you have different groups in a community, just getting different sources of information can also cause polarization because then they're just not sharing ideas with each other. It's such a deep, complicated thing. And then as you point out, there are these things where we see, for example, Russian agents promoting polarization in the US, but also taking advantage of all that anger and emotion and hatred to spread their own stories in a really effective way. I mean, as you point out, it's complicated.
How important in all of this is individual psychology? Because some of what I've read suggests that, if you could look at studies that say, well, American conservatives tend to have larger fear centers in their brains, as an example, so that there's actually something going on at the neurological level that might predispose someone to be more or less likely to buy into or question beliefs or whatever the case may be. In this broader context that you study misinformation, how relevant is individual psychology?
Well, so there are so many parts of individual psychology, but the particular thing you're talking about where there's some idea that, conservative and liberals have different genes or different emotional responses, I tend to think probably isn't that important of an explanatory factor of things like polarization and belief. So you might call that almost like a common cause explanation for ideology. Like there are certain types of people who are going to be prone to different types of ideas. But I think if you look at what ideas end up glomming into conservative and liberal, often they're really random. And what we argue is that probably it has a lot more to do with our social psychology, that holding certain beliefs ends up being a symbol or a signal that you're part of a group. And then these beliefs end up glomming together and becoming part of a meaningful group identity. So there are a bunch of beliefs that are part of conservative identity or part of a liberal identity. And it's more about group membership and maintaining that than about just having been innately different to begin with, is what we think.
What do we know about the most effective ways to disabuse people of false beliefs? If you look at, for example, the work of Daniel Kahneman, he says, we might think that if you just beat people over the head with the facts, they'll just see that their beliefs are wrong and they'll change their mind. But in fact, it sort of seems like the opposite often happens. What does seem to be effective at getting people out of false beliefs?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on what kind of belief you're talking about, because there's so many different kinds of beliefs. So for some of them, it is effective just to give people the facts. Like if you are looking at a spider and you're like, oh yeah, those spiders are harmless. And I'm like, no, trust me. I am a spider scientist and that is a poisonous spider. It's very easy to change your false belief in that case. That belief isn't really tied into a lot of your ideology. It's not part of your core identity. It's not part of your signals of in-group membership and things like that. Other beliefs, like, regulating guns will save people's lives, are much more tied into people's group membership and identity. So polarized beliefs tend to be the ones that get to be really hard to change. One thing that seems to be effective is using these kinds of little tricky trust rules we all use to try to rehabilitate groups that have false beliefs. So if you look at some group that has high levels of anti-vaxxing, so recently the Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn has had high levels of anti-vaxxing. Just going in as a doctor who's not part of that community, who people don't know, who they don't trust, and saying like, look, dummies, here's all the evidence, isn't going to be effective. But if you have someone who is part of that community who can say like, look, we share a lot of values. I'm like you. I understand where you're coming from. Here's why I think you're wrong, can be much more effective. So we need ways to communicate that take advantage of the ways humans build trust with each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm imagining there are situations where it's hard to find someone who's part of the group. I mean, fundamentally, sometimes you're dealing in conversations that are happening only between people who are not part of the same group. Are those inherently the most difficult situations to make progress in?
Yeah, I mean, if you are part of two different groups and there isn't a lot of shared trust, it can be extremely difficult to make progress and, get to someone. I mean, one thing that, as you were saying, like sometimes trying to have these conversations or share information in this way with someone who has a bad belief can actually go the opposite direction. It can push them away from the good belief and push them away from you. There's been some evidence that, as much as you can, if you can create trust, connection, like a personal connection with someone, it's a more effective way to spread information than like sending studies and yelling at people and being like, you're so dumb.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because I've interviewed a lot of former extremists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, etc. And the trend about what eventually pulled you out and what would have prevented you from getting sucked in the first place is people who expressed empathy towards me, people who connected with me, people who participated in what would be called sort of a community with me, would be the biggest kind of like de-radicalizing factor, and seems to have been. And there definitely seems to be something analogous between that and what you're saying.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
The book is The Misinformation Age. We've been speaking with the book's author, Cailin O'Connor, who is an associate professor at UC Irvine. Cailin, so great to talk to you. I really appreciate your time today.
And I'll just mention I have a co-author, James Owen Weatherall, who's also here at UC Irvine.
Yes, co-author, I should say. We never want to forget that two people wrote the book. And we will link to it with both author names, by the way, on our website at davidpakman.com/recommendations. Cailin, really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks for talking, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump has, unfortunately for Americans, once again completely embarrassed himself and by extension embarrassed the United States on the world stage at yesterday's speech that he gave in front of the United Nations General Assembly. Now, as a speech, it was horrendous, extremely low energy. It was that mumbling, stumbling Trump that often appears to be coming down from uppers, as I've mentioned before, that showed up to yesterday's speech. Now, hilariously, there were actually some journalistic descriptions of the speech that called it sober and respectful, which are the most polite possible words that you can assign to downer Trump, the version of Trump that shows up when he is in that coming down from uppers sort of mode that we've identified before. Now, of course, Donald Trump used a teleprompter, which also helps to keep Trump in that low energy mode. Something, remember, he made fun of Barack Obama for using when Barack Obama was president. It turns out, I guess, that using a teleprompter and being able to read leads to far better speeches than using a teleprompter and struggling to read, which is what Donald Trump does every single time he uses that prompter. But it wasn't just the style of Trump's speech that was atrocious. The content of the speech was disgusting as well. This was one of the most nationalist speeches that Donald Trump has given, criticizing countries that, in his view, treat the U.S. unfairly, talking about being against globalism and for patriotism, which is once again this tired anti-Semitic trope, throwing in some awkwardly worded deference to things like treating people well and valuing differences, which we have no evidence that actually suggests Trump believes or even thinks is important. Once again, downer Trump is the guy that showed up. This is the one that appears to be coming down from uppers, slurring, doing the sh thing when S's exist in words, appearing to chew on his own teeth, stopping, looking confused at the words on the teleprompter. Take a look.
The world fully expects that the Chinese government will honor its binding treaty. It is time for Iran's leaders to step forward. America is ready to embrace friendship with all who genuinely seek peace. The receiving countries are overburdened with more migrants than they can responsibly accept. Nations that empower women are much wealthier, safer, and much more politically stable. Americans will never fire or tire in our effort to defend and promote freedom. Liberty is only preserved, sovereignty is only secured. Yesterday, I was also pleased to host leaders for a discussion about an ironclad American commitment.
Extraordinarily strange behavior. I mean, just, again, genuinely strange behavior that I've heard no reasonable explanation for so far. Let's look at another moment from the speech here where Donald Trump does his globalism bad, patriotism good thing.
The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. Looking around and all over this large, magnificent planet, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique. It is why we in the United States have embarked on an exciting program of national renewal.
We're not globalists, but we are patriots. Now, as I mentioned already, extremely low energy, so low energy, in fact, that one of Donald Trump's cabinet secretaries slept through the speech. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But more importantly, looking awful, sounding awful, and the content being ridiculous. The entire criticizing globalists thing has an ugly anti-Semitic past, whether or not Donald Trump knows that, whether or not Donald Trump is deliberately referencing it for that reason. But it's a dog whistle for Jews that has been around for a very, very, very long time. But it's important not to miss the bigger picture here, which is that the United States is increasingly not part of the serious and important conversations that world leaders around the world are having, trying to solve some of the big problems of our time. The big picture is that Donald Trump's reference to an anti-Semitic trope shouldn't be allowed to distract us from an increasingly cornered and backpedaling Donald Trump on his excuses for why he would withhold the hundreds of millions of dollars in aid from Ukraine because he wanted them to smear Joe Biden while suppressing a whistleblower. And in the end, it becomes difficult to even figure out which ridiculous public embarrassment or crisis is meant to be a distraction from some other, sometimes even worse, ridiculous public embarrassment. But embarrassing himself on the world stage is something that has become, unfortunately, all too common under this presidency. I know that the Trumpists don't agree with me, and I know that they also don't care what other countries think about Trump. And in fact, they become emboldened when they hear that other countries are not even including Trump in conversations about climate change, for example. Other countries are not even including Trump in conversations about how can we get Iran back into compliance with the Iran nuclear deal, particularly given that Trump bailed on the deal without Iran having actually broken any of the conditions of that deal. And when we look at the coverage of something like the UN General Assembly here in the United States, we understandably have a very Trump-centric view, either people who love what Trump did or anybody who has a good head on their shoulders and realizes the embarrassing nature of what Trump did. In other countries, it's not just that they are much more unanimous in their understanding that what Trump said is ridiculous. It's arguably even worse, where it doesn't even really matter what Donald Trump is doing and saying, because other countries are increasingly not even including the United States in important conversations about so many of the issues that are facing humanity right now. And that's the real tragedy that it will take a long time to undo once Donald Trump is no longer president. Now, let me do a brief addendum to the Donald Trump UN General Assembly speech. This is just a short little thing. I mentioned earlier that Donald Trump's speech, in terms of its tone, was very bizarre. In terms of its content, it was disgusting. But it was also so low energy that Donald Trump's cabinet secretary, Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, slept through the speech. Now, Wilbur Ross has slept through speeches before. He's in his 80s. He may just be a really tired guy. Take a look at this video.
For this same reason, we have pursued bold diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula. I have told Kim Jong-un what I truly believe, that like Iran, his country is full of tremendous untapped potential.
if you are merely listening and not watching, as Donald Trump did that extremely low energy teleprompter reading, Wilbur Ross was visibly sleeping. And again, there are reports out from months ago about Wilbur Ross generally sleeping through meetings pretty frequently. So this isn't new, but yet just, the entire big picture of it, Trump in the most low energy, downer Trump mode that we've maybe ever seen, a cabinet secretary literally sleeping during it, while the rest of the world watches in sort of confused horror about the ridiculous things that Donald Trump is saying. We got to get this guy out. We've got to get him out by voting in November of 2020. The impeachment inquiry will not lead to a Senate conviction of Trump. We've got to get him out because it's just embarrassing. It is embarrassing to be a citizen or resident of a country where this guy is the president, and even Wilbur Ross unable to stay awake for it. Hey, we got a voicemail this morning that I don't really understand, and I want to get your help in interpreting. Our voicemail number, of course, is 219-2-DAVID-P. What do you think this voicemail caller is talking about? Take a listen.
Yes, hi, David. This is James. Just going to leave a message. I know that's a live call right now. However, my concern is the Bernie Sanders thing. Is it just a distraction? All right.
I don't get it. Is the Bernie Sanders thing a distraction? What is the Bernie Sanders thing? Is it like, do you mean that he's running for president? Or would it be a distraction from? Like, I genuinely don't understand what this caller is suggesting. Is the implication that Bernie has no shot and therefore running is the distraction? Or does he mean that media coverage, some particular I mean, I just have no idea what this person is asking about. Is the Bernie Sanders thing just a distraction? I don't know what you mean, but if anybody in the audience can help me interpret it, I would very much appreciate it. On the bonus show today, we will talk about a Los Angeles executive who got their son into USC as a fake water polo player has been sentenced to 4 months in prison. Is that a fair sentence? We will discuss. We will also talk about a European court saying that the right to be forgotten only applies to websites inside the European Union, which is a really important ruling because up until now, there was the presumption that if you are living in the European Union, but you are accessing websites like Google, for example, or another US-based website, that the right to be forgotten still applies. And this decision suggests that it does not. And Turkish leader Erdogan says that nuclear power should be either free for everybody or banned altogether. We will talk about all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to get instant access to the bonus show. Become a member by signing up at joinpacman.com. Very quick, very easy. Or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I'll see you then or on tomorrow's show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.